Hello and welcome. I'm Ankur Mishra, and today we are focusing on a striking shift in ownership at India's largest stock exchange. Yes, I'm talking about National Stock Exchange, which has crossed shareholder base of over 1 lakh now. This comes even as the exchange IPO, first planned in 2016, still remains pending. Over the last 3 decades, NSE hasn't raised any fresh capital. The increase in shareholders has been driven by secondary market transactions, with original promoters gradually selling their stake. With over 1 lakh shareholders now on board, what are the regulatory implications and what does it mean for institutional investors like LIC and SBI who hold a significant stake in the company? And what is the road ahead for IPO, which is $1 billion question? Joining us to discuss the implications are Mrugang Paranjpe, Sanjay Ashar and Sandeep Parekh. Welcome, gentlemen, to this special show. The National Stock Exchange has now crossed significant mark now. Mrugang, I want to understand from you, what does this mean? Is it just a number or number kuch kehta hai?
So I think one, in the interest of full disclosure, I must state I am one of those 1 lakh people. I do own a very small quantity of shares, but the views I'm expressing today are all related to my experiences as a capital markets person. But yes, I think it is significant to note that just like India's capital markets have become completely democratized over the last 30 years after the NSE started in 1994, I think the ownership of NSE is just another signal of the democratization of the Indian stock markets. The fact that almost so many investors want to have some part of the ownership and participate in this phenomenal growth story is, I think, a great landmark. And I think, as you rightly said, we are all hopeful that this landmark is now followed in due course by the listing of this exchange. And I hope that SEBI and other people who are involved in this decision will take the right view and right approach as they move forward on the listing of NSE.
Sandeep, I want to come to you from a regulatory and governance lens. How does NSE's crossing 1 lakh shareholders without even being listed create a gap in transparency kind of a thing?
Um, yes, I think it's NSE has gone through its challenges over the past decade or so. So that's probably the reason they've not been able to list. Clearly, I think they've been attempting to list for quite some time, and I think it would be, I won't call it a gap really, but yes, I think it would be uh, great for the exchange, which is kind of telling everybody to list for transparency, better governance, to itself list. So I think it will be a good move for SEBI to kind of go ahead and bless the listing. And again, we don't live in a merit-based system. We live in a disclosure-based system. Yeah, which means so long as whatever litigations, challenges, etc., are fully disclosed, I think there should be no problem with allowing the exchange to list. And finally, kind of short point on 1 lakh investors. I think nothing wrong with having a large number of investors, but I think it would align better with higher transparency and governance if the exchange were to list.
Yeah, I'll come to you, but before that, since we are talking about IPO, when is it happening? We have held this discussion with SEBI chairman earlier. Let's listen in what he had to say on IPO of National Stock Exchange.
So the NSE IPO, I think there has been some discussion on these points. As you rightly say, there were some points and they have replied. There are broadly 4 issues: one on governance, second on technology, third on clearing corporation, fourth is on litigation.
If they meet all 4, will they get a green
and
light?
Settlement of the litigation. And these 4, I think with a very intent to resolve and with the intent to actually make IPO possible, we should work out a solution for that.
Right, Sanjay, as SEBI chairman was also mentioning that we should work out some solution. But according to you, what are the legal implications per se when the stock is continuously traded without even being listed?
It's a public limited company and shares are freely transferable. There is only one proviso under the Companies Act which is 58.2, which is 58, proviso to 58, which says that in case there is an agreement between the shareholders or between the shareholders in the company, then there can be a embargo or there can be a fritter on free transferability of shares. But here in NSE's case, there is no such fritter, there is no such embargo, and therefore the shares are freely transferable. So from a legal perspective, there cannot be any restriction on free transferability of shares. Now, just now, in the last 1.5 months or so, the ISIN, which was frozen for the purpose of fit and proper person to be included as a shareholder, but now the ISIN has also been defrozen, and therefore the shares of NSE can be transferred on the same day itself. So, from a legal perspective, I would say that there is no embargo, although the shares are not listed. Since it is a publicly listed, public limited company, one can transfer the shares whenever one wants to.
That is the legal check. But Sandeep, what are the regulatory or structural considerations arise when an unlisted company has such a large and diverse shareholder base?
I think the law basically prohibits the company from making a public offering. What it doesn't prohibit is if it's made private placements in the past, especially to institutional shareholders or even via ESOPs, if they flow into the market, I think there's no way that you can stop that transfer from happening, because there is free transferability of shares of public companies, and kind of there can be no fetters on that transfer. That's given in the Companies Act itself. So whether it has 50,000 shareholders, 5,500, or 50 lakh shareholders makes no difference at all. Like I said, legally, of course, nothing restricts a company from listing or not listing. But with respect to exchanges, in any case, they have high transparency levels, because there's a clause in the Securities Contract Regulation Act and rules saying that all the laws which apply with respect to transparency and disclosure of a listed company will apply to a stock exchange, even if it's unlisted. So even today, I think the levels of disclosure are fairly high. But I think, like I said, it's always good for an exchange which is telling everybody else to list to also list.
Definitely. Mrugank, you have had experience of running an exchange. You are still involved in MIIs. I want to understand from you this 1 lakh, what does it mean in terms of trust as well as market depth per se?
So I think we have to understand that from an exchange ownership perspective, SEBI has really safeguarded the fact that you cannot have ESOPs, you cannot have private placements also being done. So the management of an exchange and the ownership is really very well diversified, distinguished. Now, when you have such a large retail base of shareholders, I think what is extremely important is to give all those shareholders, and let's understand that NSE was created, like many institutions in India, through the participation of our large public institutions. You mentioned the fact that an LIC, the other insurance companies, SBI, all of them hold a lot of shares. Those shareholders, for the trust and faith that they have shown in this company for the last 30 years, I think also deserve to get an opportunity to know what is the real price of the shares that they have created, right? And that can only happen when you have a public listing. Today, while there is absolutely no concerns that I would say, and I think Sandeep added to this, since SECC came in 2012, all exchanges have been deemed listed, and as deemed listed companies, they are following all the transparency norms that an exchange has to follow. So I think there are no issues that I see in terms of the governance part. SECC has ensured that exchanges are well governed. They are deemed listed. They are following all those norms. They follow the norms on ownership, which require them to keep track of owners who have more than 2%, 5%. Nobody can own more than 15%. So I think we have a very well governed structure there. But I think it is from the interest of these 1 lakh plus shareholders. And I think within that, the institutional holders who now need to get a public price for the investments that they have made. I mean, none of the large public sector units that have invested would be able to disinvest if this wasn't listed, because they would really struggle trying to get a proper market price, and divesting an unlisted share would not be the best way for them to exit from this. So I think it is much more from the perspective of getting a well-governed price that I think this will add to it. It will also give exit if any of the investors want an exit.
Sanjay, I want to understand from you, in terms of law, is there any cap of number of shareholders one can have before listing?
Nothing at all. You can have whatever number of shareholders one want to. There is no prohibition, Companies Act, securities law, SCRA, nothing at all. So theoretically, you can have even 1 million shareholders as in an unlisted public company. As long as you have not offered to more than 200 person, that is fine. And two, LIC themselves had done a process or an auction process to sell the shares 5 years back or 6 years back.
Right. So over the years, shares have changed hands multiple times, from original promoters to institutions to retail. Sandeep, how does this layered ownership affect valuation and future strategy? Does it impact?
Yeah, so I mean, what has really happened is, I think in the past it was only a handful of institutional shareholders, and over the past 5 or 7 years, I think a lot of retail investors have come in. And I think many brokers, in fact, call up the clients saying that I have NSE shares available. Would you like to buy? So it's become kind of a phone market for these shares, and I think they're reasonably liquid for an unlisted share. But obviously, like Sanjay said, it really can't get a proper fair price unless it's properly listed. And clearly, I think we have to live in a world in which you get all the benefits of listing with respect to governance, etc. And I think it's high time kind of SEBI kind of looks at it from a disclosure perspective. I'd say, and says that, okay, you disclose everything which is relevant, which is material, and go ahead with the prospectus and the IPO.
Sandeep was mentioning, I'll put forward few facts. With significant PSU ownership around 31%. Mrugang, I want to understand from you now, how important is this IPO in terms of value unlocking for long-term stakeholders like LIC, SBI and others?
I think like we have seen in India, the infrastructure space of India has been built by the shared participation of all the large institutions. To begin with, the LICs, SBIs, UTIs at one point of time would invest and create what was then really the larger companies. And then when the opportunity came, like we saw in the case of a CDSL, like we are now hopefully also going to see maybe in an NSDL, there is an opportunity to unlock. So I think the whole process of creating large public infrastructure, which has always been the responsibility, which has been taken up by the large PSUs of India, whether it is an LIC or SBI or any of these organizations. But for them, at some point of time, they need to unlock their capital, unlock their value so that they can maybe invest in other companies, they can invest in other infrastructure. So I think you have to keep this sort of process going. Otherwise, you're really going to have a situation where you're just locking up the capital and it's not getting utilized for anything more productive or beneficial. So from that perspective, I think it will be very important for all the financial institutions if they are able to unlock some value. It doesn't mean that they have to really get out, and many of them have not done that in the last few years also. But I think it's the opportunity that is most important, and it's a fair opportunity that large Indian PSUs should have, which I guess they are not having in a very good way today.
Sanjay, you mentioned the legal standpoint of view, but don't you think fiduciary gap is there for incoming shareholders per se if it is not listing on exchanges? I mean, exchange is not listing on exchange now.
No, there is no, as long as there is a market, somebody who is buying the shares knows very well that the shares are not listed on any exchange, and there is a market without the shares getting exchanged, without the shares being listed on an exchange. So to my mind, there is no fiduciary issue or any other issue. As long as you are investing with an open mind and with open eyes that, look, there is no listing. There may not be listing for the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and yet you are buying the shares because tacitly there is already a market with 1 lakh shareholders. Obviously, in that sense, there is a market without being listed on the exchange. So to answer your question from a fiduciary issue, I don't foresee an issue from a fiduciary perspective.
Right. Sandeep, you did mention that it is one of the most liquid stocks even without being listed on an exchange. But do you think that if there is further delay per se in the clearance of IPO, will it impact investor rights or even liquidity expectations in the future, or it will continue according to you?
Let me answer that in a roundabout manner, which is, I don't see any downside to listing, right? There's only upside. You get more transparency. You get much. I really don't see a downside. And like I said, since 1988, we have moved away from the merit system. So there's no reason that a regulator should stand in the way of a fully disclosed company doing its IPO. So for me, it's a bit jarring that all these years, the regulator has in fact said that there's some major litigation pending and therefore we won't allow you to list. In fact, that's the reason to push somebody to list, that you're a market infrastructure entity. So long as you have fully disclosed the pros and cons of the litigation, you should in fact go ahead and list. So these reasons don't really kind of add up post 1988. We've had a disclosure based system.
Right. Mrugank, what are the lessons that can be drawn from international exchanges or past Indian listings that saw similar evolution? I can understand the scale is completely different, but what is your point of view? Is there any parallel learning?
I think we've got both examples, international as well as domestic. And while the 2010 Bimal Jalan committee initially had a slightly different view, we completely laid the path for how listing should happen. You had 2012 when MCX listed, 2017 when BSE listed. And I am 100% sure, having been part of those organizations as well, that the fact that we were listed added in every sense to the governance, in fact, made it more importantly good for our investors, and was actually a good way of making sure that governance standards were really, really upheld. So I think this was something which we have seen in the domestic experience. If you now compare internationally, amongst the largest exchanges globally, almost a lot of them are listed, and I think they all benefit from it. So I think, over time, we would in fact have NSE as a standout case, which is not a listed exchange itself, whereas all its global peers in terms of size are already listed. And while, like we said, yes, the Indian examples have not been the same in terms of size, we have seen the benefits of having listed exchanges in India, listed MII entities, and I think that is the way to go forward.
Sanjay, any example that comes in your mind? We are giving that disclosure that scale can be different, where such kind of share base is there, but listing is not there, nationally or internationally.
Yes, nationally, there have been in the past instances where some of the banks, as also some of the energy companies, did have shareholders which ran into 25,000, 50,000, but at the same time it was not listed. And there were transactions which were happening in the shares. So I don't foresee. So my point is that yes, in the past there have been instances.
Right. Overall, if I say, what are the lessons that can be drawn, particularly from this episode, in terms of changes which you think there should be legal changes or government should amend few of the laws? Anything which comes in your mind, Sandeep?
No, absolutely not. In fact, there's no requirement to change anything. I just think that the regulator seems to have forgotten the disclosure-based regime that we live in, and I think we need to go ahead based on whatever other disclosures to be made. And I don't think there's any reason to change any laws. And I think there's, like Mrugank said, there are only upsides to an IPO. There are no downsides.
Right, now I'm going to do kind of a poll from all three of you. We have heard what SEBI chairman said. We have heard the views of all three gentlemen here. But in what timeline do you see NSE IPO getting listed, starting from you, Mrugank?
I would say this financial year, but maybe closer to the end of the financial year.
Sandeep?
No, so I wanted to list it ASAP really, as I don't see a reason for any delay.
Sanjay, what is your informed guess?
Informed guess is what? It should happen as soon as possible. And as Mrugang said, that no later than, I mean, it will happen in this financial year and mostly in the last quarter of this financial year. So I would tend to agree with that as well.
All right, there is clear-cut timeline, whether you talk about informed guess, whether you talk about the possibility of listing NSE this year is very high as per the discussion we have had with these gentlemen. Thank you so much, Mrugang, Sandeep and Sanjay, joining at this hour to discuss an important milestone in the unlisted space where exchange of the size of National Stock Exchange has crossed 1 lakh shareholders. Now all eyes are there as and when it gets listed on another exchange. Thank you so much for watching this special discussion.